During the height of the North Dakota oil boom, the Bakken region drew thousands of workers. The work was harsh and the hours relentless, but the promise of money made it worthwhile. In a place defined by motion, people came and went constantly. Disappearances were not unheard of. Most were explained. Some were not. In February of 2012, Christopher Casey Clark became one of the unexplained ones. Casey was 29 years old, working as a truck driver and building what he believed would be a stable future in the oil industry. Then, without warning, he vanished. His phone stopped responding. He missed work. No one heard from him again. Police in Newtown, North Dakota, launched a search, but there were no signs of violence, no financial red flags, and no evidence that pointed clearly in any direction. Over time, leads dried up, and the case slowed, quietly slipping into the growing pile of unresolved disappearances tied to boomtown life. What investigators didn't yet realize was that Casey's disappearance wasn't random. It was deliberate. James Henriksen and the business of ambition. James Henriksen arrived in North Dakota with a plan and little patience for obstacles. Along with his wife at the time, Sarah Henriksen, he launched Blackstone Trucking, a company that hauled water to oil drilling sites. The business expanded rapidly. More trucks were added. More drivers were hired. To outsiders, Henriksen looked like a textbook success story born from the oil rush. But success for Henriksen wasn't enough. As Blackstone grew, so did complaints. Investors began raising concerns, and rumors circulated that money was being mishandled. Soon, flyers appeared across North Dakota accusing James and Sarah Henriksen of fraud and deception. The accusations were damaging, especially in an industry built on trust and reputation. Investigators later traced those claims back to Doug Carlisle, another businessman in the oil sector and a former associate of Henriksen. Carlisle wasn't just criticizing Henriksen privately, he was actively undermining him. Deals were falling through. Potential partners hesitated. For Henriksen, Carlisle wasn't just a rival, he was a threat. A broken promise to Casey Clark. Around the same time Henriksen's reputation was under attack, Casey Clark entered his orbit. Henriksen recruited Casey with the promise of a management role at Blackstone Trucking, an opportunity that would have marked a major step forward in Casey's career. But when Casey arrived, the offer quietly disappeared. Instead of managing operations, he was assigned to drive trucks like everyone else. Casey noticed immediately. He was vocal about his frustration and began talking openly about leaving the company to work elsewhere. For most employers, an employee leaving would have been inconvenient. For James Henriksen, it was intolerable. Investigators would later describe Henriksen as impulsive and ruthless, a man who viewed people as tools and loyalty as non-negotiable. When Casey talked about walking away, Henriksen didn't try to negotiate. He looked for a permanent solution. Hiring a killer. Through his inner circle, James Henriksen was eventually connected to Timothy Succo, a man who operated on the margins of legality and had little hesitation about crossing lines most people wouldn't approach. Henriksen didn't rant or threaten. He didn't need to. The arrangement was businesslike, stripped of emotion and ideology, reduced to a simple exchange of money for silence. $20,000 was the agreed price for removing Casey Clark from the equation permanently. There was no elaborate plot, no dramatic confrontation. That was the point. Henriksen wanted the problem solved quietly, without attention, without loose ends. On February 22, 2012, Casey Clark was killed exactly as planned. What happened afterward was just as important as the act itself. Casey's body was never recovered, leaving investigators with nothing tangible to chase and his family with no place to grieve. In a region where people frequently moved for work and disappeared from contact, the absence of remains created a fog of uncertainty that worked entirely in Henriksen's favor. Weeks turned into months, months into years. Henriksen continued running his business, expanding contracts, and presenting himself as a legitimate operator in the oil fields. To the outside world, nothing seemed out of place. But for Casey's family, time froze. Without a body, there was no closure, only the quiet dread that something terrible had happened and the fear that the truth might never surface. For nearly 2 years, Henriksen believed the past had been buried along with the evidence. He was wrong. Doug Carlisle becomes the next target. While the murder of Casey Clark faded into uncertainty, Doug Carlisle remained a living problem. Despite Henriksen's attempts to marginalize him financially, Carlyle continued to spread accusations that Henriksen was running fraudulent operations. The damage was no longer theoretical. Business relationships suffered. Trust evaporated. Henriksen's carefully built image began to crack, and for a man who relied on control, that loss of influence was intolerable. Once again, Henriksen reached for the same solution that had worked before. Timothy Succo was contacted and hired for a second time, reinforcing just how normalized murder had become in Henriksen's decision-making process. This wasn't an escalation in his mind, it was maintenance. The first attempt to kill Doug Carlyle failed when Carlyle wasn't home, an inconvenience rather than a deterrent. Succo regrouped and returned, more patient and more deliberate. On December 13, 2013, Succo entered Carlyle's home in Spokane, Washington, and waited. There was no rush. When Doug Carlyle arrived with his wife Alberta, the attack was immediate and brutal. Multiple gunshots rang out, ending Carlyle's life before emergency responders could do anything to help. Alberta witnessed the entire attack, expecting to die alongside her husband. She didn't. Succo left her alive, a choice that would unravel everything Henriksen thought he had perfected. The evidence that spoke. Unlike Casey Clark's disappearance, Doug Carlyle's murder produced a crime scene rich with physical evidence. Forensic investigators recovered DNA that clearly did not belong to anyone in the household, and that single detail shifted the investigation from speculation to precision. The genetic material was traced to Timothy Succo, leading to his swift arrest. Once in custody, Succo chose cooperation over silence. He confessed to killing Doug Carlyle and named James Henriksen as the man who ordered the hit. When investigators pressed further, presenting cell phone location data that placed Succo near North Dakota on the day K.C. Clark vanished, the full scope of the operation came into focus. Succo admitted that Casey's murder had been his first job for Henriksen, tying the two cases together with chilling clarity. Two deaths, one employer, one motive. Distance and time no longer mattered. The web around Henriksen tightens. Despite the weight of Succo's confession, prosecutors understood that a case of this magnitude required reinforcement. They found it in Rob DeLau and Todd Bates, the intermediaries who had facilitated the connection between Henriksen and Succo. Both men confirmed the discussions, the payments, and Henriksen's intent, filling in the remaining gaps with damning consistency. The evidence accumulated rapidly. Phone records showed contact patterns. Financial transactions traced the flow of money. Testimony from multiple witnesses painted the same picture from different angles. Even without Casey Clark's body, the narrative was undeniable. James Henriksen had ordered 2 murders to eliminate threats to his business and reputation. This time, there was no ambiguity, and nowhere left to hide. Convictions and sentencing. In 2016, James Henriksen was convicted on 11 federal charges, including solicitation of murder and murder for hire. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms in federal prison, ensuring that he would never again have the power he once abused so casually. Timothy Succo pleaded guilty, receiving a 30-year sentence in exchange for his cooperation. Justice came, but it came incomplete. Casey Clark's body was never found, and that absence still echoes. Where the killers are now. Today, James Henriksen is incarcerated at USP Atwater in unincorporated Merced County, California, far from the oil fields that once fueled his ambition. Timothy Succo serves his sentence at FCY Fairton in New Jersey, his life reduced to routine and confinement. For Casey Clark's family, the absence remains. No burial, no final goodbye. Just the knowledge that his life was taken for convenience, not necessity. This case was about control, about a man who believed money could erase consequences and silence opposition forever. He was wrong, because even in places where people disappear and fortunes rise overnight, the truth has a way of resurfacing, and when it does, it leaves no room for escape.